Welcome, folks. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining. Welcome to our misinformation briefing. Welcome, welcome. We are just going to give folks a minute to join before we get started. Thanks for being here, folks. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We are just going to give folks 1 minute before we get started with the program. Thanks for being with us. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being with us. We'll get started in just a moment. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for being here, everyone. Welcome. Awesome. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We are so excited to have you with us. I'm calling in from all across the country, whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter today. Welcome to our misinformation briefing. Today, we will be discussing misinformation, a topic that's prevalent in all of our lives. We may see it online, on TV, within mainstream news channels, or on social media. And misinformation can be dangerous and harmful, and all of us have a role to play in combating it. We're here to help you understand what misinformation is and how it's impacting us and our ability to make progress on climate and clean energy solutions. Also, we'll talk today about how you can take action to counter misinformation and disinformation in your day-to-day life. So we're going to hear from experts from EDF, Friends of the Earth, and Media Matters today about what misinformation and disinformation are, how they're impacting climate action and elections, and what you can do to help fight back. So we're going to start our program with a brief discussion and debunking of some recent misinformation trends, and then move into a panel discussion with all of our wonderful experts and hear from EDF leaders on how you can get involved. I'm thrilled to introduce first Alana and Abby from Media Matters for America. Alana is a senior researcher at Media Matters. She spent years working on social media production and research, and her work now focuses on identifying climate misinformation and disinformation. Welcome, Alana. And Abby is a misinformation educator, TikTok content creator, and producer at Media Matters for America. Abby's an executive board member at EcoTalk, a collective of environmental educators on social media. So Abby, welcome. Thanks for being with us. And first, we're going to move to Abby for a presentation on some misinformation approaches and tactics. Abby, I'll go ahead and put your slides up.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here talking to you about this. My job is to really give you an overview of just some of the tactics that we see fossil fuel actors using to kind of confuse the space. So let's get right into it. Go to the next slide. One of the things I really want to stress, because a lot of the time we talk about fossil fuel disinformation, we're thinking about denial, right? That like the climate change denial machine from the 90s or like 2010s, early 2000s. And that has shifted a little bit, and it looks a lot more like delay, which is a little bit more subtle. And the goal of delay is pretty self-explanatory. It's to delay climate action by any means necessary. So that could look like downplaying, so like understating the threat of climate change, possibly saying it would be good for us, right? Like CO2, more plants. It could look like dividing the public, so making the passing of climate action legislation really difficult, creating wedges within the climate action communities and dividing the climate advocates so that it becomes really hard for everybody to speak with one voice. It could be deflecting blame, which might be overemphasizing individual responsibility. We all know those carbon footprint calculators and like pushing all of the responsibility onto individuals. And sometimes it could be like doomism narratives, right? So like it's too late, it's too big of a problem to solve. We're never going to be able to address this. So I want to show you some specific examples of specific tactics. If we could go to the next slide, please. So one very well-known, I think, tactic that a lot of people have seen is greenwashing, which is when they take a product, right, a policy activity, and make it appear more environmentally friendly or less environmentally damaging than it is. A lot of the time, as you can see with these visuals, right, you're adding images that look very like natural and they look climate friendly. And they're stating like they're low emissions, but these aren't necessarily also being met with actions. They're all about marketing. This presentation of green imaging, like the being in nature, is often called nature rinsing as well. So next slide. And this fits more broadly into the tactic of misdirection. So again, very self-explanatory as far as like the name of the tactic. So instead of focusing on the actual harm that these companies are doing, they're going to redirect our attention away to something else. So that could be kind of virtue signaling, oftentimes for queer communities, virtue signaling support for racial justice and inclusivity. So here we have like an energy company, Total Energies, posting about Juneteenth. Or another energy group proudly celebrating Black History Month. It also could be sports washing. So that's when they are diverting that attention to focus on their participation in different games and sports. In the bottom corner, we have them talking about how they're funding all of these education programs, right? So this is, successful marketing in a lot of ways, but it redirects our attention away from the actual harm that they're doing onto something that we can celebrate and that we agree to be good. And another big tactic here is redirecting responsibility, pushing that responsibility away from them, right? So that we don't need top-down legislation. Instead, putting that responsibility on individual consumers so they change their habits. And you celebrate the ones who are changing their habits best, right? Like whether that's, driving the individual choice to drive an electric vehicle, individual carbon footprint reduction. These are all examples here of that shifting from corporate responsibility and like the responsibility they play in the climate crisis onto individual choices. Another common tactic that we see is astroturfing. So this is this comes from the term for grassroots activism and grassroots organizing, which is a bottom-up organizational structure. And astroturfing is when you're using fake grass, right? Like, so you are faking that organized grassroots movement. So it's designed to create the false impression of a widespread grassroots movement to support that goal, but in reality, it's being initiated by some sort of concealed group. So it could look like an independent advocacy organization, but if you actually dig into who is running these organizations, who set them up, despite the fact that they are implying they are citizen-led, they are actually being funded by fossil fuel interests and run by PR professionals, and they have goals to push public support for or against specific policy actions and whatnot. We also see them quite often attacking leaders and experts, and I think we've seen this a lot too when it comes to climate protests, activists who are speaking out. And that might look like harassing environmental organizations, the activists, leaders, scientists. Famously, Dow Chemical hired a security company to spy on environmental groups like Greenpeace for several years. And the point of these attacks is really to, it accomplishes several things. It erodes public trust in scientific institutions because you're going after these scientists, you're going after the organizations, going after the leaders. It also intimidates experts and activists because they know that there's a threat now to them speaking out. It makes it much harder to feel like you can safely advocate for climate action. And it wastes people's time and energy. It's very effective because that energy that now you're dealing with misinformation about you or harassment campaigns, is energy that you could have been spending on promoting climate action, but now you have to deal with this problem. And I think that that kind of brings me over to Alana's points, because I really want to just give you a broad overview here of some of the tactics, and she's going to dive into specific examples that we've seen recently.
Hey everyone. So excited to be here. And as Abby said, I'm just going to go into a few examples. So I'm just going to jump right in here. As we know, the fossil fuel industry and the organizations it funds, so think tanks, for example, they've launched a decades-long campaign to protect their bottom line by prolonging our dependence on oil and gas. So a lot of the work we do at Media Matters is looking at how right-wing media has really helped the fossil fuel industry shift its messaging from climate change denial to climate change delay. And Abby really highlighted this. So, it's partially kind of shifted from, climate change isn't real or humans aren't causing climate change, to making statements like renewable energy harms the environment more than fossil fuels. So renewable energy has been a really popular target for disinformation recently. And so I'm just going to get into that right now and give you one specific case study that we have been looking at Media Matters. Offshore wind farms specifically have been a really popular topic of disinformation, particularly because of President Biden's energy agenda. In 2021, the administration set a goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So the fossil fuel industry is really looking to hamper and kind of hinder this goal. And they're doing that also not only by pushing delay, but dividing the public and pitting the goals of renewable energy advocates and the goals of conservationists against each other, and trying to convince the public that they're not aligned, when in reality, they really are aligned. So the way that sort of this went down, and you can see on this slide some of the examples of statements made by actual experts versus the right-wing media pushing disinformation about this topic, is that the conversation first was basically that government agencies, environmental groups, and offshore wind companies were exploring how wind farms could impact whales and trying to find ways to prevent that. And that is a statement very rooted in reality. And what happened was Fox News portrayed renewable energy opponents, some of whom had ties to right-wing think tanks that have led lawsuits against renewable energy projects and crafted pro-fossil fuel legislation. Kind of promoted information being spread by these people, and then this disinformation then proliferated on social media, particularly Facebook. So as a result of that, we had the conversation really shifting from, what it was before, to prominent media personalities making statements such as, offshore wind farms are slaughtering whales, which there's absolutely no evidence for that, as we can see here from the quotes from the Marine Mammal Commission and from scientists at institutions such as the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And you can also see that sometimes on Facebook, some of this misinformation was labeled. I have an example post here of that was labeled as misleading and missing context, because it made this false claim that offshore wind is killing whales. So we can move to the next slide now, where we have a couple examples of misinformation that was unfortunately not labeled on Facebook, making very similar claims. One from Fox News host Jesse Waters. This post really got a ton of traction. And unfortunately, we found that we did a little study and we looked at posts that mentioned wind energy on Facebook from top political pages. And we found that out of 288 of these posts, 84% specifically mentioned this unsubstantiated claim, which really gave us the impression that this misinformation had really permeated into the mainstream and had picked up a lot of following on social media. And so now I'm going to just give a few other examples and one more broad trend. We have this kind of broad trend of anti-vaxxers pivoting from spreading misinformation about COVID and COVID vaccines, and now vocally opposing climate action by falsely portraying it as a veneer for controlling every aspect of society. So they're using very conspiratorial language. And this language we're seeing it apply to basically not just climate policy. And one example of that would be the effort to electrify electric vehicles. But even just, making up, making up initiatives such as a couple of years ago, the claim that the Biden administration would take away your hamburgers gained a lot of steam and popularity. So really ranging from you know being based on actual policy to being based on nothing at all. So we really have been seeing this trend where we're seeing these um, COVID COVID deniers now shift to climate change conspiracies. And not only that, but conspiracy theorists are also spreading misinformation about climate driven disasters, suggesting that they were planned to carry out these restrictive measures to restrict freedom of movement, to take away choices, and to diminish overall quality of life. And on the next slide, I'm just going to show, I have two examples of that, and that's going to be our last slide. One really crazy example was on social media. A lot of conspiracy theories about the wildfires in Hawaii were spreading, with people even suggesting that the government somehow spread these fires on purpose in order to sort of implement some sort of a smart city situation that was more climate change friendly. And that seems crazy, but unfortunately, we really saw a lot of pickup in these types of conspiracy theories after that. And again, after the wildfires in Canada, where the wildfire smoke was really affecting cities all around the country and really affecting the air quality. With that, I'm going to pass it along, I think, to our other speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alana. And we are now going to transition into our panel discussion. So we will be welcoming back Abby and welcoming our other panelists, Lauren, Erica, and Elise to the stream. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Alana and Abby, for kicking us off and giving a little bit of context on some recent trends in the big picture on approaches and misinformation tactics. Abby, Alana, welcome back, and welcome to our three additional speakers, Elise, Erica, and Lauren. Before we dive in, I'm just going to ask each of you of our new guests to say a hello and briefly introduce yourselves before we dive into the discussion. So, Elise, could we jump over to you first for a quick introduction, and then we'll move to Erica and Lauren to say hello.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Elise Merton. I am the manager for persuasion research and campaigns at the Environmental Defense Fund. And before this, I worked on anti-disinformation work for the progressive political group Progress Now.
Great. Thanks so much. And Erica, over to you. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I work in press at Friends of the Earth, another environmental organization, and I also work on climate mis and disinformation for the Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition, which is a coalition of about 50 or so global organizations committed to fighting the purpose of this panel, which is the spread of climate mis and disinformation that's impacting climate action. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks so much. And Lauren, welcome. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Giddy. I've been at EDF for 16 years now, and I head up our audience insights work. And also, I am one of the co-founders, excuse me, of the US-based portion of that coalition that Erica just talked about. And just so you know, we started with Greenpeace, Union of Concerned Scientists, Media Matters got involved really early. So this was also in late 2018, early 2019. So boy, did we have some interesting stuff ahead of us. But thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lauren, and welcome to this whole panel. It's so great to have such a panel of experts here to talk about these really important topics. So we will dive right in, and we're just going to start with the basics. We already covered this a bit, but just as a review, can one of you or a few of you speak to what misinformation and disinformation are and how they differ? I'm happy to just open it up if anyone wants to jump in on that first question.
I can jump in. So the difference between mis and disinformation really comes down to a matter of intent. Misinformation is content spread perhaps somewhat harmlessly without the intent to intentionally deceive. So if a family member shares a false news article just because they perhaps didn't read or check the source thoroughly, that's misinformation. Disinformation is content that is circulated with the intent to deceive. So, for example, and we can get into this later, when a fossil fuel company downplays the severity of their role in the climate crisis, even though they are fully aware of the climate science, they continue to spread that content anyway. That is what we call disinformation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Erica. And I really think that covers it. It's great to have that basic understanding as we dive into some of the details here during this panel. The next question is about conspiracy theories, and I welcome anyone to jump in on this one too. How do conspiracy theories arise and build a following, and how do conspiracy theories specifically impact the climate action space and the clean energy and climate fields?
I feel like this is Abby's expertise.
Yeah, so it's a big question of like where conspiracy theories come from, because there's a lot of answers. On one hand, they are a very natural human phenomenon. There's part of like the way we process the world, right? We are sense making machines, and sometimes that sense making process goes into overdrive and can often, create conspiracy theories, especially when people feel a sense of powerlessness and they feel anxious and insecure. That can lead to conspiracy theories. But then, from a more manipulative top-down place, you also have people, organizations, groups who will capitalize on that sort of those conspiracy communities to like create sentiments of distrust. And we see that a lot in the climate space. Is that as climate change becomes harder and harder to deny, conspiracy theories become more and more of like kind of the last remaining rhetorical device to just hijack the entire conversation, because now we're not really having a conversation about climate policy or anything that's like tied into reality of like how we're going to fix this problem. Now we're having a conversation about how, global elite are using the climate crisis to like lock down cities. Like we're in a completely different reality, and it makes it really hard to get anything done. So they're really effective when it comes to just delaying and just kind of creating an informational chaotic informational space where we can't get anything done.
I want to also recommend that anybody who's interested in this to follow Abby on her social channels. She went viral maybe more than once with an image that really shows how people can dip their toe into conspiracy and then end up falling deep into it. So
Yes, absolutely. Thank you both, and I certainly will share the links to where Abby is, Abby's social, so folks can follow along. But I think that question and your response, Abby, really speaks to the broader picture that we're hoping to get at here, which is the question about like how these trends and topics that we're talking about today are impacting our ability to get things done and to move forward clean energy solutions, and why this matters to our membership audience that might be interested in activating and taking action on climate and moving these really important priorities forward. So I'd welcome other thoughts, Lauren, others, if you have anything to add on how these trends and topics and how misinformation and conspiracy theories are impacting our ability to advance climate action in this country.
I feel like Elise was going to talk. Did I interrupt you, Elise?
Oh, no, I was just going to add that one other reason conspiracy theories are so prevalent is that we are dealing with a lot of complex scientific information that the average layperson may not have the context or the schooling to understand. And conspiracy theories give a very simplified explanation of something that feels very big and overwhelming. So it's easy to embrace that instead of putting in the work of trying to figure out why exactly climate change causes both droughts and wildfires.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Abby.
That's such an important point too, because when we account for the fact that like, a lot of people don't know the basics about climate change. A lot of people don't have strong climate literacy. It's not something that's like taught across the board. It's not something that's been prioritized to the degree that I think it should be. That means that like conspiracy theories can almost become this framework for understanding your lived experience of the climate crisis. So like if you see changes in the environment and you don't know how to make sense of it, it makes a lot of sense that people who haven't been given like climate literacy education, who don't understand it, would turn to the conspiracy theories to like feel like they understand what's going on. Why are all of these changes happening?
Yeah, so the only addition I'll make is we're also starting at a deficit with our communications. We don't have the funding that the opposition has. We are more of a, I might call us a scrappy kind of reactive movement at best. And we're not always the best at amplifying and repeating our messages. So yeah, we're just already in the information space, starting from behind the start line.
Absolutely true. Thanks so much, folks. And does anyone else have anything to add there on that question about how it's impacting our progress forward before we move on? Great. Well, now we'll turn to Elise. I know we heard a lot about misinformation and disinformation last election cycle in 2022 and in its aftermath. And certainly as we're thinking about the 2024 elections, it's really critical to understand like how is misinformation playing a role in our elections, and what did this look like last cycle, and how could it have an impact in 2024?
Well, big lie on January 6th aside, which is a big aside. One thing that I noticed a lot in the past election was there was a lot of well-intentioned misinformation and a lot of very deliberate disinformation about when, where, and how to vote. I'm sure people will remember there was a lot of debate over whether or not voting by mail was legal or how you're supposed to do it in your state. And I think because of that, and because voting varies by state and by precinct, people would sometimes, with the best intentions in the world, share information that was not true about their particular neighborhood's polling place, or about how you should register to vote by mail, or whether or not you would be registered to vote by mail if you voted by mail in a past election. So I anticipate, since there still is, unfortunately, ongoing disinformation from the right about whether or not Trump got the votes that he says he got in Georgia, that there's going to be a lot more misinformation and disinformation around the practicalities of voting going into the 2024 election. I would urge people just to do their due diligence when it comes to where they personally can vote, and not to rely on AI like ChatGPT or Alexa or Siri to tell you where to vote. The Washington Post recently came out with an article at the start of October about how when one of the reporters asked Alexa if Trump won 2020, Alexa cited an article from, I believe it was The Rumble, which was a far-right site that claims that Trump won the election. So do your own work. Make sure that the sources that you are citing are correct. And please go to your state's official webpage that gives instructions on how to vote, or how to register to vote, or how to request a mail-in ballot.
Yeah, thank you, Elise. Really helpful, and certainly, important to know where to go to find your voting information. So thank you for that as we prepare for this really big election year next year. Great. And my next question is a big one. So I welcome everyone's thoughts, but maybe we'll go over to Erica first. I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the different bad players in the mediums that are operating in this space. And, what does this information ecosystem look like right now? And how are social media platforms taking action or not taking action to limit the spread of social media online? I'll turn it over to you first, Erica, on that question about our mediums and bad players and the full ecosystem, but I'll welcome others' thoughts as well after.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and I could talk for an hour at least, but I'll try to condense this into a couple of minutes. So, in terms of this ecosystem, we have essentially two buckets of bad actors. On one side, we have right wing conspiracy theorists and climate deniers from all walks of life, social media influencers, podcast pundits, and politicians who speak on behalf of big oil because that's essentially who lines their pockets. And on the other side, we have big oil itself, and they engage in a covert kind of disinformation called greenwashing, which is essentially a means by which oil and gas companies try to market themselves as more environmentally conscious than they actually are. Saying they're planting trees or supporting electric vehicle transitions while polluting our air and dumping oil into the ocean, essentially. In terms of in terms of this ecosystem, we have a conglomeration of narratives, which Abby jumped into a little bit, the delayism tactics. However, unfortunately, we're also starting to see a startling rise in flat out denialism. So much so that two of the front running Republican presidential candidates are very, very passionate climate deniers. And it's unfortunate because I feel like we were all starting to breathe a sort of sigh of relief that denial narratives may have been fading, but clearly they aren't. But the reason that these narratives are spreading so widely and resonating with so many people is because unregulated social media companies are complicit, essentially, in the spread of climate misinformation. And their profit model, big tech's profit model, puts clicks and engagement over the truth. And I'll point to a report that came out in September from our coalition called Climate of Misinformation. It is a scorecard report that scored and ranked 5 major platforms: TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Pinterest, on their ability and willingness to address climate misinfo. Out of 21 available points, only one platform, Pinterest, received more than half of the total points, and Twitter only received 1 point, which is unfortunately unsurprising because the CEO of Twitter himself has openly tweeted climate misinformation. And platforms like Meta, which encompasses Facebook and Instagram, they have cosmetic language, as does Google, with respect to YouTube, in their community standards or their misinformation policies that address climate content. But we have research from a wide variety of people, from Friends of the Earth to Green Latinos to the Center for Countering Digital Hate to Stop Funding Hate. A bunch of well-versed researchers have shown that enforcement is seriously lacking. And until platform decision makers step up, or lawmakers mandate that these platforms step up, we can expect the problem to get worse, because as natural disasters grow in severity, which we are clearly seeing that they are, so will the disinformation surrounding the events themselves. And yeah, I think that covers most of the main points. I will defer to other people for any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that I think that was a great summary. We've seen, I've done this year and last year quite a few studies, and specifically on Facebook, looking at the extent to which, for example, content is being fact checked, is being labeled as misleading, and have consistently found that, misinformation on very large pages being repeated over and over again, that, really should be sort of picked up by fact checkers, is being overlooked. And it's just very difficult to successfully run this sort of operation. So we are kind of seeing over and over again with all different sorts of topics, and especially during, news events and during times, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were seeing a ton of disinformation around the definition of energy independence, so-called energy independence, around oil and gas prices and what controls them. So really during these moments when people need to understand what is happening is when platforms are really failing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. If others have anything to add, Lauren, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add too that the people who are seeing the misinformation is also not just your Joe Rogan fan. The audiences span different generations, different political ideologies. We can't really just say, oh, this is a problem that extreme right people are dealing with in their echo chamber. It could be your son playing Fortnite is exposed to it. It could be You know, we just released a report, and maybe my coalition partners can remind me what the name of it is, but with Green Latino about Spanish-speaking misinformation. It's not confined to that stereotypical group we think of when we think of climate deniers. So I just wanted to add that piece as the audience insights person.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lauren. And that is so true. I know some of the, members and activists in the field have told me that they've ran into and experienced misinformation and disinformation in many spaces. So I'm sure many of the folks tuning in live with us now have seen this pop up and are understanding more kind of the depths of how it's impacting their lives and their activism. Thank you all. A big question, and I'm sure, as Erica said, we could talk about it for hours. But we'll move right along now. Abby, we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, and I'd love to dive a little deeper on the question of why people believe misinformation and spread misinformation. So I know there's a lot of different factors here, and human psychology may have something to do with it. So I'm happy to dive in on what your thoughts are and open it up to others too after we hear from Abby.
Yeah, so overwhelmingly, we believe misinformation when it confirms our existing worldview and our consisting ideology. Like that is like one of the biggest factors, right? We go around the world looking for pieces of information to confirm that we are right and that our understanding of the world is right and that we don't need to make change because change is scary. And like we all do this. This is literally the human experience. This is how we kind of form a cohesive sense of self. But that does mean that like we're pretty vulnerable to people who are interested in manipulating that. So yeah, misinformation that, because like, when we have a problem like the climate crisis, a lot of the time it does really conflict with our identity. If our identity is rooted in this understanding that like the economy as it's set up is like perfectly functional and totally works, and like we feel like we have a strong sense of self in the system as it is, then it's really hard to also support systemic change. So we will go and look for pieces of information that tell us that we're right and that like we don't actually need to make that change. And on top of that, if you also consider the fact that like climate change is really scary, it's a really, really daunting problem. And for a lot of reasons, it's much easier psychologically and emotionally to like stick our heads in the sand and not confront it than like we're dealing with this human desire to feel comfort and to feel secure and to feel like we are safe and we understand the world. And climate change is a threat to all of those feelings. So there's so many reasons why it makes it very easy for people to believe it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Abby. And does anyone have anything to add there just on the question of like why people are believing the content that's out there in terms of misinformation and disinformation?
I think sometimes too it can be because this misinformation or disinformation is coming from a person in authority. Speaking from someone who just came from politics over to an NGO, quite often politicians will say things that are not true, and the people who voted for them believe that it is true because their politician, their state senator, their president even has told them this, and that person obviously has access to more information than they do, so they must be right.
That's a very good point. And on that too, like the way media frames these issues also plays a role in how we understand it. So, for years, media would do like a side by side of like one scientist who believes in climate change and one who doesn't, even though that was not reflective at all of the actual, composition breakdown of the number of scientists that do recognize that climate change is real. But they were framing it as though it was a debate. So the way that the media presents these issues also can prime people to, buy into one narrative over another.
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add one more thing, and I was trying to remember, Abby, if you mentioned this, but I think we really are seeing just kind of a decline in trust in our institutions writ large, and that that is really propelling people's likelihood to believe misinformation, and especially after something like a global pandemic where a lot of people were really struggling, really having a hard time, losing access to a lot of the things that a lot of joy they found in life. I think made it more likely to turn to sort of a way to explain everything that was going on that seemed more straightforward.
Absolutely true. All great points. And my final question, and I'll share, Abby touched on this. I recognize for our audience that this conversation might feel concerning or daunting or troubling, but there are certainly things that you can do to get involved and take action that we're about to dive into in a little more depth with Lauren from the EDF team. But first, I just want to welcome the other speakers before we dive into that portion of our program to share anything that people can do now to get involved in taking action, whether with their organizations or in their day-to-day lives, just to get involved in taking action, making sure that they're combating climate misinformation. So I welcome other folks to add any thoughts, and then we'll move over to Lauren to talk a little more in depth about how our attendees can get involved.
I can suggest something that you all should not do.
That's great.
One thing I would definitely caution folks to not do is to directly engage with any false or misleading content that you are seeing, because by clicking on links, by commenting on posts, you're just adding engagement value to that content, which is going to continue to keep it continue to allow it to boost on whatever platform, whether it be Facebook or Twitter, especially Twitter. So the best thing that you can do is report it. Definitely arguable about whether reporting on some of these platforms is actually doing any good, but it's better than engaging with the content directly. So that's something that I would recommend.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I was also just going to say, share fact checks, share content that is reliable. Lauren had said that, a lot of the opposition has a really strong echo chamber. So we're really trying to push back on that. So we really need kind of a coordinated effort to get correct and reliable information out there. So just doing that whenever you can, I think, is helpful.
Yeah, and building off of what Erica said, that like not engaging, I would even argue like go further, log off. Like, the more time that we're spending having these discussions online is like time that you could be, organizing in your community. So I really think that like one of the biggest things that we can be doing, one of the best things we can be doing to address misinformation and to minimize the harms of misinformation is to actually be encouraging people to like pick a community action that they want, that they care about. Is that going to your city council and pushing for composting? Is it like pushing for, asking for a plant-based option in school lunches? Like whatever it is, however small it feels, like get engaged with your community and actually push for that action and have conversations with people in real life. And then when you do encounter somebody who is, very like has beliefs that are deeply rooted in climate misinformation, you can spend all the energy you want trying to argue with them. I would actually instead encourage you to like see if you can, instead of trying to change their entire ideology, focus on one policy. Is there a specific policy point where you guys can like find agreement rather than trying to argue that their entire worldview is wrong? Because that's very hard to do in a conversation and not usually that successful. So like push for those small policy wins when it comes to both like how you're engaging with your community, but also how you engage with like specifically like misinformed people.
Yeah, what a fantastic point, Abby. And I certainly will drop the link in the chat to access our list of local and virtual events and activities for folks to take action on climate. EDF Action is building political power in lots of states and communities across the country to really organize on these issues. So as Abby said, pouring your time and energy into that is a great way to make sure you're forwarding these solutions. So a huge thank you to this panel. You all are brilliant. And this was such a informative and exciting conversation to be a part of. So I thank you all. We are going to move right over to Lauren to talk a little bit and dive a little deeper on that question of how folks can get involved. So we'll go ahead and dive in there. And again, thank you to this wonderful panel of speakers for being with us and for teaching our members so much about misinformation, disinformation, and how we can combat it.
Thanks so much, Emma. So I'm going to say this at the top of this and then at the bottom. We are creating and have created a community that I'm I'm hoping will be our echo chamber, like Abby suggested, a community of folks who are truth tellers, who can attempt to. I don't think we ever will match the funds of the opposition, but we can try. And I EDF is doing concertedly trying to build a community of folks who can help us with this. It's called the Anti-Misinformation Brigade. I think Emma is going to share a link to how you can sign up to that. But as far as how you can help EDF in this fight, I'm very happy to say again that we are part of this coalition that Erica mentioned, climate what is it? Oh, it's CAD. It's Climate Action Against Disinformation. Sorry, I totally messed up my abbreviations there. Climate Action Against Disinformation. You can go to caad.info and you can see all the research, all the great work that we're doing there. But as far as researching the problem, understanding the problem, educating folks on the problem, um, trying to or advocating for better policies for social platforms, and also even working with policymakers in the US and even in Europe. Um, this coalition is doing a lot of that work and it's important work. It is more of a long-term game though, because it's all about um, making social platforms better by incorporating policies. And we all know how long that might take. But there are some short term things we can do, and that's really where EDF is focused. And like you've heard this theme throughout, there is a lot of bad information out there and not enough good information out there. And so it's not just a numbers issue, it's also a quality issue. Environmental groups are really good at shouting facts at people and saying you should do this because it's the right thing to do. And what we've struggled with is tying it into that worldview that Abby discussed. That's so powerful. Tying it into folks' belief system that they already have, so we don't have to convince people necessarily to move to climate action. We can just tie it into something that's already quite convincing. And I have an example of this. We are currently working on shoring up support for the Inflation Reduction Act. As you may know, the biggest climate action legislation that passed, was it 2 years ago, 1 year ago at this point? 1 year ago, we just had the anniversary. So we are working on supporting a lot of those pieces. And one big piece is phasing out gas infrastructure so that we can, fill that with clean energy infrastructure. And a big piece of that you may have heard, or a big talking point for opposition and delayers that you might have heard, is around gas stoves. And so we have done a bunch of really targeted message testing around, well, how can we convince somebody who thinks that someone's coming to take their gas stove away from them, which is a huge violation of their American rights. How can we pivot and talk about something else that might tie into their belief system? And we tried a bunch of different message frames, and we found one that works. And it has to do with health. It has to do with talking about the actual indoor air pollution that comes with your gas appliances, specifically your gas stove. So this is something we want to share with you. We want you to read about how we're talking about this issue so that you can arm yourself with a narrative that might work with folks. So this is just one of the many ways that EDF is trying to arm and build an echo chamber, but also build a narrative that people can attach to and start to change their minds about certain things. So the other thing is really just about encouraging you to talk about it more. And I really like what Abby said about logging off and doing this in person. It is research shows that the most effective way to change someone's opinion that endures, like a long-term opinion, is that one-on-one non-judgmental conversation. So we also want to arm you with the facts and the ways to do that through this newsletter and this community that we're building. Just a one fact that might, or some survey results that might help you, encourage you to talk more about climate change or global warming. Even though 2/3 of Americans are worried about climate change, only 37% of Americans say they actually discuss climate change issues with their friends and family. And that's occasionally, not even often. So we want to encourage you to help us build this echo chamber, understand that we aren't talking about these issues as much as we should, given that most people you meet are going to care about it. And just being that support system for you so that you don't feel alone in doing that. So again, it's the Anti-Misinformation Brigade. It is a monthly newsletter that goes out. There'll probably be more things that we'll do around that as far as building community as it grows. But I invite you to click on the links. That I hope Emma's sharing, I can't see. But click on those links and sign up. I also want to reiterate, you should also absolutely follow Abby. She's doing debunkings all the time, and it's just good content for you to share as well.
Great.
Emma, over
Thank
to
you
you. Yep.
so much, Lauren. And thank you to all of our viewers tuning in. There are links in the chat to access those resources that Lauren just mentioned so that you can get more involved. But that concludes today's program. So thank you again for joining us, to all our participants and attendees tuning in online. And thank you to all our speakers for a great conversation. We're so grateful to have you all join us, and that all of our attendees today have learned more about how to take action in the fight against misinformation and disinformation. So it's important to continue to spread the word. And we thank you again for your time today. So that concludes our program. Thanks so much.